parks, but those people that are contemplating it. And I think this is the intention. So if I say some things that you violently disagree with, that's fine. We can discuss them. Some of the things may sound a little controversial. Some of them have already been said, which is very encouraging. So the big thing about the title I chose was the word sustainable SDGs. And I think that is a very important parameter when you look at it in the African context. So let's just have a look. As we all know, this is not a new concept. It's been around for nearly 60 years. At this moment in time, you have to ask, we've heard it already, nearly 400 parks who are members of the IASP. In addition to that, there are large areas like the United States where they have their own organizations. Some are members of IASP, but there are another probably 50 or 60 parks there. So you're looking at of the order of 500 parks around the world. Africa has a total of 6 full members. And in fact, all 6 have happened in the last 14 years, but probably the majority in the last 5 years. So I think we're looking at a situation to say, why is it that Africa has been so slow in taking this concept forward? The one thing to remember if you look at this is to say how many attempts have been made, and certainly in South Africa over the period from 1980 onwards, I would say there are at least 5 attempts to start science parks with good intentions, with good vision, etc., which if you visit them now, as we heard from Jürgen this morning, they've turned into regular business parks. And one must say, well, what happened? What was the dynamic of that process? And then as a continent, what have we learned? As I say, people have been trying to do this for 20 or 25 years. But have we ever come up and started to look at it from an African perspective to say, why hasn't it become a standard item? What is it that's different? And I think that's what we want to challenge. Now, obviously one of the issues is that the parks tend to be established by governments. The question is, when they start the parks, what policies are actually creating the ecosystem that allow them to succeed? And we've heard those words this morning during the panel discussion, this debate about what do you need to be in place for projects of this nature to work. And I think we also heard, and I want to come back to it, I'm getting worried that a lot of the content of parks is dictated by government policies. We need a biopark, we need a this, we need a that. We've got to ask ourselves, do we have what it takes to be a biopark? Do we have what it takes to be a clean tech park? What is it that we're trying to create? So I want to actually challenge us and ask the tough questions. Now, interestingly enough, in 2006, the AU published a document called Africa's S&T Consolidated Plan of Action, and in it they defined a program, number 5.6, happened to be the last program in the book, which I think already tells you something. And it was to promote the creation of technology parks, 2006. Well, 7-8 years later, if you look around Africa, how many countries have responded to that? That was a specific agreed at presidential level. They agreed on that process. I don't know of a single park that has resulted from that. I think if we look back, and certainly I'm as guilty as all, we followed the developed world. We followed, at that time, this is the late 1990s. Remember, that was the era when ICT was basically the buzzword. You had this massive growth in small companies around the world. course, just about the time we started the Innovation Hub in Pretoria, the bubble burst. And that was a little bit of a setback for most of the thinking that had taken place. Not unlike what happened in 2008. But if you look at the developed world, they have systems of innovation which are strongly based on traditions of R&D. Since the Second World War, R&D has been identified as a source of so many technologies. But what differentiates that from us? First of all, I think they've had good experience of transferring that technology to industry, and this has given rise to something that's called the linear model of innovation. And I wonder how many of you in your policies and so on have got this wonderful vision which says basic research, applied research, development, and serendipity happens and innovation happens. And that, unfortunately, is a model that's deeply embedded in our psyche. It's easy to understand, and many people are still thinking that way. Now, the reality of that is, when you look at it from a research perspective, researchers invent. Researchers rarely innovate. Remember, Lewis Sands made a very interesting definition. Innovation isn't innovation till the customer tells you it is. So if you're an inventor, who's the customer? Actually, the patent attorney is the customer, at best. It certainly isn't a commercial product. And I think until we in Africa can differentiate between invention and innovation and understand that from one to the other is not a 5-minute exercise. There are a number of steps. And those steps relate to business understanding. In reality, we're going to keep inventing. And I think we have lots of inventors. We have very few innovators, or not enough innovators. So I think we have to look at this in terms of our science parks. Do we, in fact, sort of link science parks to the expectation that we are going to get the deal flow, like the small companies, the new ideas flowing from the R&D world? It happens in the developed world. Is it true here? Another factor which we must take credit for. Our R&D base is a very small percentage of the world's R&D base. I don't know what the number is, it's something like 0.05%. In a globalized world, I can locate a group in the world who is doing state of the art. Probably takes half an afternoon on Google. The reality of it is, why should I deal with the local chap if I can go to the best in the world a few hours later and probably get a response from them? So the reality is, we must be realistic. We must ask ourselves, where are our true competences, our deep competences from which we build? Being a Me Too in R&D does not make you able to set up global companies. So I think these are the challenges. If we accept the fact that the developed world is a different environment, but we build our science parks on those as background assumptions, do we set ourselves up for risk? Now, going back to the consolidated plan of action defining technoparks, the interesting comment about that definition, Program 5.6, was that they are setting up the technology parks to ensure that R&D generates products and services, i.e., the mindset is that linear approach. So we have to ask ourselves, how did we set up our parks? How are we setting them up? And in fact, what are the different challenges that we have to face? Now, when STPs are set up, and certainly I can remember this, some of the mindsets that you have, first of all, you start certainly certainly in the late 1990s, it has to be a park, so you need a piece of land. You start with a real estate view. Now, assumptions you make. If we build it, they will come. Foreign investors must be attracted. Why? Give me one good reason. Why do foreign investors come to a country? Do they come because there's a piece of real estate? Not really, but when you're building it, you sometimes feel a bit euphoric about what you're doing. The financially viable and sustainable projects will be developed within a few years. We heard this morning, how long does it take to develop a park like this? I think the minimum from start to moving into a site like that is probably 7 years, something like that, from a feasibility study through. So you have to keep a project like that alive for that sort of period. I think if we look at it from the requirements, we assume that there are going to be lots of spin-outs from R&D. We've talked about that. That jobs will be created. Most governments in Southern Africa have jobs as the highest priority of their requirements. So any project like this would have a requirement to create jobs. Because the science park is a facilitator. It doesn't create the jobs directly. So it has to do it through its tenants, through its companies, through its programs. When you look at the financing, and it's probably true to say that Botswana is probably the major exception in terms of the priority that that project is being given in the national strategy. The sums of money that we heard about this morning are very significant. The Innovation Hub in Pretoria was granted 258 million rand. Again, a substantive amount of money. But is it a one-off? What happens after that? What happens to phase 2, 3, 4, 5? We heard from the Innovation Hub this morning. They are now growing and starting to build the next building. But they haven't built anything since 2005. That's 7, 8 years of a gap. So R&D tends to be the focus of budgets. The science park is seen perhaps as an infrastructure development or once-off payment. And I think it's important that we have to put that into context. What is the ongoing support for that project? In some cases, the monies come under government regulations. In South Africa, there's something called the Finance Management Act. That is very restrictive in terms of what you do and how you take risks and so on. So it actually removes a certain amount of the ability to be entrepreneurial in the way you manage a park like that. So again, you have to be sure of the environment in which you're getting that money. And I think when you start with the real estate, you have to be very careful that you don't create monuments. And we'll come back to that. But let's look then at Africa. We said there are actually 18 members of IASP, 6 full members, a number of affiliates, and some associates. And that is a great move forward from being 1, which was the case probably until 2005 or thereabouts. However, recently, a very interesting innovation center in Zambia called Bongo High, if you love the name, and the IHub in Kenya, we'll talk more about that later, conducted a study. And they talked and analyzed over 100 centers in 27 African countries that are involved with similar types of projects. Not major real estate, but projects to encourage innovation, entrepreneurship, and socio-economic outputs. Only 2 of their 100 actually were part of the 18. So 16 of the people who are members of IASP didn't get noticed in the Bongo Hive IHub study, which is worrying. But I think the question is, are such initiatives happening in Africa? In fact, yes, they're happening all over the continent. But are we picking up, and are we linking, and are we sharing, and are we understanding? Let me just ask a question. How many people in the room came to the African Innovation Summit on Cape Verde in February? How many people knew about the African Innovation Summit in Cape Verde in February? 1 person. 2 people. There were about 500 people there. It was a very thrilling event. And a lot of these issues were debated. And Southern Africa particularly was appallingly represented. It was very, very concerning as to why we were not there. So I think, again, we heard this morning, it's so important to share, to communicate. And science parks live in a global way. But if we can't communicate with these other 98 operations in Africa, are we missing something? So let's have a look. Are there different types of these hubs? How do we characterize them? And part of the little study that we did and presented at the African Innovation Summit was around trying to characterize some of the activities. And one of the observations, and I think there's a lesson in that, we wrote to a number of people, some of the members of IASP and beyond, and we found it extremely difficult to get information. Some of them didn't even bother to reply. And that was a huge concern, because in actual fact, the one thing about a science park is if you get an opportunity to publicize what you're doing and to communicate it, you should jump at it. So, in fact, there's a lesson there. You know, are we really communicating? So let's have a look. And we sort of characterized what we collected into 3 different groups. We have what we call the traditional science parks, and I think, having listened this morning, I think I would probably change some of those classifications. How is that characterized? They have state-of-the-art facilities, they attract research-based startups, they have large amounts of capital investment, and they're usually government-driven. They have advantages in that they in fact, have a reputation. They are something. They can attract attention, and that's very important. They have alignment, often with national and regional policies. They look at the high-tech communities, and their financial stability is stable if government provides ongoing support. If government suddenly changes its priorities, I don't believe there's a single one of these projects that can survive. And that is a huge concern. If something is going to take 15, 20 years, you've got to be absolutely in the minds of the government of the time and able to know that support is going to carry through. So very important, traditional parks. The second one is we call activity-based parks. The ones that actually don't have too much real estate but are very active. They have lots of added value, they have lots of interactions, they have innovation programs, they have strategic partnerships, etc. And I think we heard this morning that people are thinking in much more of the activity base. They They look towards explicit business needs. We heard, for example, Monty in East London. They talked about the fact that they linked to the industrial development zone. The industries are on their neighbours. They can build on that. And emphasis on the business cooperation. There are challenges that they do get support from government, but in fact I think sustainability stays on the agenda. They're not quite the iconic sort of programs, so therefore I think there's a higher vulnerability. They've got not much to show for it other than the activities. And then the third group is really around the co-creation models. And those are all about really collaboration, interaction, and people working together. And we'll see where that fits in. So if we plot a few of these, I think classic science parks, you've got the initiative in Mozambique. We put Botswana Innovation Hub there. I think I would move it down now. And the Innovation Hub in South Africa. All of those really came the route of the traditional science park. The latter two certainly have got a lot of activity going. The VUT Science Park, the Vaal University of Technology, is built around a major internationally positioned product development centre, which in fact is very closely aligned to the industry in a whole area of southern Gauteng and the Free State, and in fact is really not growing a vast number of tenants at this stage, but what it is doing is building up very strong relationships in terms of, if you call them virtual clients, in the region and beyond. You've got NBIC in Windhoek, very much the activity-based centre, occupies a couple of old houses which have been refurbished, but it's got on with the job. So the real estate is only now being considered after a while, and again, the real estate tends to be focused on incubation, which is where they are putting their current focus. You've got the various M-Labs in South Africa, we also have M-Labs in Kenya, ICT-based, more incubators, strong mentoring of ICT. An interesting one is the Bandwidth Barn. It's never claimed to be a science park or an incubator. It's a business initiative in Cape Town, privately owned. It has 55 resident companies. It has a very, very broad base of industry relationships. It's doing a lot of the same things, but it somehow seems to keep out of this debate. And that's very interesting, very successful, and it is sustainable, which again is interesting. And then the Bongo Hive sitting very much in that category. And the Fringe, another initiative in Cape Town. The old downtown area, which is now frequented by lots of creative people, be it fashion, be it designers, architects, artists, etc. It's an urban science park in a sense. They're looking at an urban creative zone, completely different model. Really trying to look at it as a tourist venue, trying to promote the interests and the interactions of numerous businesses. Different model. The question is, it's been adapted to the circumstances. So what you see is the projects here at the bottom, here at the third, what we've called the third generation, tend to be more adapted to the immediate situations. I'm not going to go through these. There's really an emphasis on some of them. Let me just highlight a couple, particularly the challenges. Traditional science parks, I've said, you've got this long takeoff period. They're very capital intensive. If you've got a 70-hectare site, the Innovation Hub in Pretoria was 60 hectares, of which 30 could be developed. If you don't have a very, very good strategy for developing the rest of that site in terms of who's going to make the investment. If you're relying on government to invest on the buildings to occupy 70 hectares or 30 hectares, you're probably living on the wrong planet. And that becomes a handicap if that isn't agreed up front as to how you're going to handle that. So when you get a large piece of land, it comes with all sorts of maintenance and it comes with a lot of challenges. The trouble with that is, when you're managing a park of that nature, the real estate dominates your thinking. And so the risk is that you start focusing too much on the real estate from a survival point of view, and guess what takes the pain? It's the added value. And that, I think, is one of the drivers that you have to be extremely cautious about. The other one, of course, is, do you have the tenants to fill the buildings that you're building? Do you have the deal flow? And what often happens is, yes, you get a number of enthusiasts who are going to move on the site, but they might occupy 20% of your building. Where do the other 80% come from? So that period up until you move in is going to be absolutely pressurized in terms of knowing how you're going to occupy those buildings. Empty buildings do not convey a positive message, and that's important. And of course, the traditional ones might have rigidity in the objectives and measures. We heard this morning, I think all the parks, the focus areas that they are developing came out of local policies. I actually worry about that. If those policies have not been deeply understood in terms of their business potential. So, let me just highlight a couple of things. Yeah, I think we've covered most of those. So what are some of the sort of factors that affect the establishment of a science park? I think the very first one is to go back to the policies. We still have in Africa no policy. I don't know of a country that has a policy that focuses on science or technology parks as a specific focus. We talk about STI, but I think the S is big, the T is medium size, and the I is in lowercase. Because that's the way the world works. And then the parks tend to be requiring a big I. Now, if we take Lewis's comment, shouldn't we be talking about the ITS system? That the real goal is the I. The T is what moves to I, and the S is driving the T. But have we got the order right? And unfortunately, I think from a policy perspective, if there's a science park mentioned, it's like the CPA, Program 5.6. It's the one that got added on at the end. And that's disturbing. Because until we have policymakers that know what the innovation cycle looks like and know that you cannot get from R&D to a satisfied customer by hope. There's got to be mechanisms, there have to be support vehicles, there has to be facilitation, and many other parameters. We don't have too many links between the S&T and education policies and industrial policies. Those two don't necessarily talk to one another. When you measure STPs, and there are always measurements, and the funding often depends on that, the measurements are often of such a high level in terms of where government is coming from that they're difficult to achieve. And I think most of these will have creation of jobs as one of their parameters. That's quite a tough one, especially if the target is large. We see it in incubators. An incubator must create so many jobs. Incubators don't create jobs. They make companies able to create jobs. But that is very careful that the parameters you're being measured against are actually ones that you can control. I've mentioned the regulatory systems. I think the R&D base generally thinks in terms of human resource development. In South Africa, we have a major program to generate PhDs. And the hope is that those PhDs will drive the innovation system. Now, you have to check whether that's a reality. Do the PhDs, are they entrepreneurial? Do they have any business interests? What's the relationship? And are they actually studying fields that have any linkage to the local business needs? And I think so. Education programs, ticking boxes with numbers in it, isn't necessarily the right way to go if you're driving a system of innovation. We heard the word this morning. Focus. Play to your strengths. Look at your competitive advantage. Now that means train people, encourage people to drive those very areas. If you're good at mining, become very good at mining. If you want to be in beneficiation, you better train some people that aren't miners to beneficiate, because the industries are different. But unless you understand the downstream, you better start to look at your education system and say, are we producing unemployable PhDs? And that is a risk. So I think the alignment of these various policies becomes critical. The Science Park is, of course, a beneficiary of that, because the expectation is we have lots of PhDs, so the Science Park should be able to turn them into businessmen. Okay? Bit of a challenge. And then, of course, what is the buy-in from the local business community? I was thrilled this morning when I heard from the Chamber of Commerce in Botswana this absolute statement: let's collaborate, let's all work together. I mean, that from business is exactly the behavior you want. Now, the question will be, who's knocking on his door tomorrow or tonight to say, how do we follow that up? Because that's a door open, and that's a relationship that is absolutely vital. And then, of course, the last one is foreign direct investment. Why do companies invest in other countries? They go there because there is something that will benefit their business. They're not philanthropists. They're not interested in real estate that looks magnificent. What they're interested in is collaborating, probably acquiring something that they don't have that will enhance their business. So if you track it around the world, I'm sure that most of the companies that invest in other countries do their homework very thoroughly, and it's based on the content of what they're looking for. So when we say a science park will attract foreign direct investment, let's be very careful of that statement. It's very difficult to get a major company, and remember, you want them to invest in innovative behavior in your country, not in what I call brown box moving. You don't want them to occupy your park so that they increase their sales volume. That isn't why you want them. So your foreign direct investment, if you look at countries like India or China, they're there with a purpose. China may be slightly different because it's a huge market, so there is great benefit in being there. We don't have, unless we think Pan-African, we don't have a massive market per country for them to think of investment. But do we have the technical firepower to attract them? Let's look at the real needs. Certainly my experience at the Hub, in 10 years, I think we had one spin out from a university. And that spin out was actually some professors who got fed up with the university administration. That's quite a statement. So the point is, the assumption that your entrepreneurs come from universities at this moment in time, without some training, without the support, without the interaction to change the mindset, you are going to find your entrepreneurs come out of business as spin-outs or as employees that have good ideas but don't relate to the core purpose of the business they're in, or they're going to come from natural entrepreneurs in the field. And a lot of those entrepreneurs come from the youth. So, what are they looking for? They're looking for environments that stimulate collaboration, there's co-creation, networking, facilitation, access to funding, access to markets, etc., etc. Convenient and good services, a meeting place, some ICT that's available. They lack mentorship, they need mentorship, they need incubation, they want to know about setting up a company, all the governance, IP counseling, etc. And their ambitions are often local, so not necessarily immediately thinking the global world. And there's got to be policies that are willing to invest in those sort of people. So when you look at those 100 outfits that were looked at by the Bongo Hive, you actually find that they operate in that space. And let me give you an example. We hear a lot about it, but the IASP in Kenya, in Nairobi, it has a membership listed on their books of people that interact with the IASP of 30,000 people. Now, I don't know of any other initiative that has attracted that much interaction. They've also produced some very, very bright entrepreneurs who are going forth. I think they're now starting to realize they need incubation, they possibly need some sort of parks for people to live in. So I think they're going the other way. They're going to drive the need. But I think what's interesting is it's very attractive to a very large number of smart, young, unemployed people who have the ability to learn new skills. And I think we've got to take note of that in the context of our STPs and other projects, is to say, is that part of the STP agenda? Is that an allied organisation? Where does it fit? But I think neglecting that and not learning from it is something that I think we do at our peril. So what are the lessons? I think we have to be careful of coming into these projects with a kind of concept of the way the world works and building to meet that kind of vision, not with sufficient perhaps understanding of the environment. The demographics, 50% of the population of most of our countries will be under the age of 25. Many are unemployed. That, as somebody said in South Africa, is a time bomb. I don't know that it's a Science Park's responsibility, but I think Science Park thinking can be applied, as they've done in those other 27 countries, to think of how you address that issue. And I think this could be one of the routes to deal flow for science parks. Bright ideas taken forward. I think we've got to look at tailoring our projects to each country. There's no silver bullet to this. Experimentation and piloting are critical. You're going to make mistakes. Make small mistakes once. And I think that's very important. You can learn a lot by doing and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So the Big Bang approach is not necessarily the only one in town. The lack of capital paralysis is something we have to overcome. And I think a lot can be done with a little money if one is thinking of the activities. And I think one of the most important things, and one of the people who've spoken for years on systems of innovation, the core message is it's all about interactive learning. It's what we're doing here. But once a year, once every 2 years isn't what it's about. That is a continuous process. So all of you should be swapping business cards and then intending to talk to each other. Whether it's on social media or any other thing. One day I'll discover what that means. And I think therefore we need as an IASP community to say we need to understand what's happening in these other hubs. We need to say how do we collaborate with them, how do we join forces. But I think Africa as a whole, in this whole